The Atlantic slave trade or transatlantic slave trade took place across the Atlantic Ocean from the 15th through to the 19th centuries. The vast majority of those enslaved that were transported to the New World, many on the triangular trade route and its middle passage, were West Africans from the central and western parts of the continent sold by other Western Africans to Western European slave traders, with a small minority being captured directly by the slave traders in coastal raids, and brought to the Americas. The numbers were so great that Africans who came by way of the slave trade became the most numerous Old World immigrants in both North and South America before the late 18th century. Far more slaves were taken to South America than to the North. The South Atlantic and Caribbean economic system centered on producing commodity crops, and making goods and clothing to sell in Europe, and increasing the numbers of African slaves brought to the New World. This was crucial to those Western European countries which, in the late 17th and 18th centuries, were vying with each other to create overseas empires. The Portuguese were the first to engage in the New World slave trade in the 16th century. Between 1418 and the 1470s, the Portuguese launched a series of explanatory expeditions that remapped the oceans south of Portugal, charting new territories that one explorer described as oceans where none have ever sailed before, in 1526, and other countries soon followed. Ship owners considered the slaves as cargo to be transported to the Americas as quickly and cheaply as possible, there to be sold to labor in coffee, tobacco, cocoa, sugar and cotton plantations, gold and silver mines, rice fields, construction industry, cutting timber for ships, in skilled labor, and as domestic servants. The first Africans imported to the English colonies were classified as indentured servants, like workers coming from England, and also as apprentices for life. By the middle of the 17th century, slavery had hardened as a racial caste. They and their offspring were legally the property of their owners, and children born to slave mothers were slaves. As property, the people were considered merchandise or units of labor, and were sold at markets with other goods and services. The Atlantic slave traders, ordered by trade volume, were the Portuguese, the British, the French, the Spanish, and the Dutch Empire. Several had established outposts on the African coast where they purchased slaves from local African leaders. These slaves were managed by a factor who was established on or near the coast to expedite the shipping of slaves to the New World. These slaves were kept in a factory while awaiting shipment. Current estimates are that about 12 million Africans were shipped across the Atlantic, although the number purchased by the traders is considerably higher. Background: Atlantic travel. The Atlantic slave trade arose after trade contacts were first made between the continents of the Old World and those of the New World. For centuries, tidal currents had made ocean travel particularly difficult and risky for the ships that were then available, and as such there had been very little, if any, naval contact between the peoples living in these continents. In the 15th century, however, new European developments in seafaring technologies meant that ships were better equipped to deal with the problem of tidal currents, and could begin traversing the Atlantic Ocean. Between 1600 and 1800, approximately 300,000 sailors engaged in the slave trade visited West Africa. In doing so, they came into contact with societies living along the West African coast and in the Americas which they had never previously encountered. Historian Pierre Chaunou termed the consequences of European navigation disenclavement, with it marking an end of isolation for some societies and an increase in intersocietal contact for most others. Historian John Thornton noted, a number of technical and geographical factors combined to make Europeans the most likely people to explore the Atlantic and develop its commerce. He identified these as being the drive to find new and profitable commercial opportunities outside Europe as well as the desire to create an alternative trade network to that controlled by the Muslim Empire of the Middle East. which was viewed as a commercial, political and religious threat to European Christendom. In particular, European traders wanted to trade for gold, which could be found in Western Africa, and also to find a naval route to the Indies, where they could trade for luxury goods such as spices without having to obtain these items from Middle Eastern Islamic traders. Although the initial Atlantic naval explorations were performed purely by Europeans, members of many European nationalities were involved, including sailors from Portugal, Spain, the Italian kingdoms, England, France and the Netherlands. This diversity led Thornton to describe the initial exploration of the Atlantic as a truly international exercise. Even if many of the dramatic discoveries, such as those by Christopher Columbus and Ferdinand Magellan, were made under the sponsorship of the Iberian monarchs, that leadership later gave rise to the myth that the Iberians were the sole leaders of the exploration. African slavery. Slavery was practiced in some parts of Africa, Europe, Asia and the Americas for many centuries before the beginning of the Atlantic slave trade. There is evidence that enslaved people from some African states were exported to other states in Africa, Europe and Asia prior to the European colonization of the Americas. The African slave trade provided a large number of slaves to Europeans and many more to people in Muslim countries. The Atlantic slave trade was not the only slave trade from Africa, although it was the largest in volume and intensity. As Alicia Imbacola wrote in Le Monde Diplomatique, the African continent was bled of its human resources via all possible routes. Across the Sahara, through the Red Sea, from the Indian Ocean ports and across the Atlantic. At least 10 centuries of slavery for the benefit of the Muslim countries. 4 million enslaved people exported via the Red Sea, another 4 million through the Swahili ports of the Indian Ocean. Perhaps as many as 9 million along the Trans-Saharan caravan route, and 11 to 20 million across the Atlantic Ocean. According to John K. Thornton, Europeans usually bought enslaved people who were captured in endemic warfare between African states. Some Africans had made a business out of capturing Africans from neighboring ethnic groups or war captives and selling them. A reminder of this practice is documented in the slave trade debates of England in the early 19th century. All the old writers concur in stating not only that wars are entered into for the sole purpose of making slaves, but that they are fomented by Europeans. With a view to that object, people living around the Niger River were transported from these markets to the coast and sold at European trading ports, in exchange for muskets and manufactured goods such as cloth or alcohol. However, the European demand for slaves provided a large new market for the already existing trade. While those held in slavery in their own region of Africa might hope to escape, those shipped away had little chance of returning to Africa. European colonization and slavery in West Africa. Upon discovering new lands through their naval explorations, European colonizers soon began to migrate to and settle in lands outside their native continent. Off the coast of Africa, European migrants, under the directions of the Kingdom of Castile, invaded and colonized the Canary Islands during the 15th century, where they converted much of the land to the production of wine and sugar. Along with this, they also captured native Canary Islanders, the Guanches, to use as slaves both on the islands and across the Christian Mediterranean. As historian John Thornton remarked, the actual motivation for European expansion and for navigational breakthroughs was little more than to exploit the opportunity for immediate profits made by raiding and the seizure or purchase of trade commodities. Using the Canary Islands as a naval base, European, at the time primarily Portuguese traders, began to move their activities down the western coast of Africa, performing raids in which slaves would be captured to be later sold in the Mediterranean. Although initially successful in this venture, it was not long before African naval forces were alerted to the new dangers. and the Portuguese raiding ships began to meet strong and effective resistance, with the crews of several of them being killed by African sailors, whose boats were better equipped at traversing the West African coasts and river systems. By 1494, the Portuguese king had entered agreements with the rulers of several West African states that would allow trade between their respective peoples, enabling the Portuguese to tap into the well-developed commercial economy in Africa, without engaging in hostilities. Peaceful trade became the rule all along the African coast, although there were some rare exceptions when acts of aggression led to violence. For instance, Portuguese traders attempted to conquer the Bisagos Islands in 1535. In 1571, Portugal, supported by the Kingdom of Congo, took control of the southwestern region of Angola in order to secure its threatened economic interest in the area. Although Congo later joined a coalition in 1591 to force the Portuguese out, Portugal had secured a foothold on the continent that it continued to occupy until the 20th century. Despite these incidences of occasional violence between African and European forces, many African states ensured that any trade went on in their own terms, for instance, imposing custom duties on foreign ships. In 1525, the Congolese king, Afonso I, seized a French vessel and its crew for illegally trading on his coast. Historians have widely debated the nature of the relationship between these African kingdoms and the European traders. The Guyanese historian Walter Rodney has argued that it was an unequal relationship, with Africans being forced into a colonial trade with the more economically developed Europeans, exchanging raw materials and human resources for manufactured goods. He argued that it was this economic trade agreement dating back to the 16th century that led to Africa being underdeveloped in his own time. These ideas were supported by other historians, including Ralph Austin. This idea of an unequal relationship was contested by John Thornton, who argued that the Atlantic slave trade was not nearly as critical to the African economy as these scholars believed, and that African manufacturing at this period was more than capable of handling competition from pre-industrial Europe. However, Anne Bailey, commenting on Thornton's suggestion that Africans and Europeans were equal partners in the Atlantic slave trade, wrote, "TOC Africans as partners implies equal terms and equal influence on the global and intercontinental processes of the trade. Africans had great influence on the continent itself, but they had no direct influence on the engines behind the trade and the capital firms, the shipping and insurance companies of Europe and America, or the plantation systems in Americas. They did not wield any influence on the building manufacturing centers of the West."